Right. Mr. Mennell.
Thank you, my lady. In their authoritative critique of Britain's battle with coronavirus, George Arbuthnot and Jonathan Calvert conclude that the handling of the COVID pandemic by Boris Johnson's government was one of Britain's worst ever failures of state and political leadership. This stark conclusion has been reinforced during the Module 2 hearings as shocking, at times shameful evidence has been heard on core decision-making. It is inconceivable, we submit on behalf of the children's rights organizations we represent, Just for Kids Law, the Children's Rights Alliance for England, and Save the Children UK, that my lady will conclude that the government's response to the pandemic was anything other than deficient and dysfunctional in multiple respects. As a nation, we literally sleepwalked into disaster as over 230,000 people in the UK have tragically died from COVID. Our record in terms of excess mortality and deaths from COVID relative to population is one of the very worst amongst the world's wealthier nations, notwithstanding Boris Johnson's abject refusal to accept so, and the heroic efforts of our grossly underfunded and under-resourced National Health Service. It is irrefutable that so many deaths could have been prevented had our government acted more decisively, effectively, and humanely at various stages of the pandemic in 2020 and 2021. Understandably, the primary focus of Module 2 has been on the lessons that must be learned if we are to avoid a similarly cataclysmic loss of life in a future pandemic. Nothing that we have raised in the questions we have asked witnesses, or raise now in our closing submissions, is intended to criticize that focus or deviate from it. However, we trust the inquiry will agree that even though children were the least likely of any age group to die from COVID, the overall lasting impact of the pandemic and the government's non-pharmaceutical interventions on children, particularly vulnerable children from lower-income backgrounds, was damaging, even devastating, and that this important matter is also worthy of consideration by the inquiry within its terms of reference. Secondly, if Module 2 is going to investigate the impact of high-level decision-making on the entire population, it would be wrong to ignore the over 14 million children who constitute nearly 25% of the population. Thirdly, there is no need for the inquiry to reinvent the wheel. There have been a plethora of published reports and studies that document the disproportionate and adverse impact of the pandemic and the government's MPIs on children. The evidence is unequivocal and uncontentious. Nobody has suggested anything to the contrary. As to the full extent of harm caused to children, we appreciate that this will be explored in greater detail by the inquiry in 2025 during a later module on children and education. Nevertheless, my lady, there are important, unchallenged points that can properly be made at this stage about children and core decision-making for the purposes of the interim report which we understand the inquiry intends to publish in 2024. My lady will appreciate that there is an urgent need for lessons to be learned quickly as to the impact of the pandemic and the government's MPIs continue to be felt by children in terms of, for example, cognitive developmental delays, educational inequality, and increased mental ill health. We urge you not to put children to the back of the queue by delaying all conclusions about children until the later module. We urge you to say as much as you possibly can about children in your interim report to acknowledge their resilience and sacrifice. Having made those introductory remarks, we now want to make some general observations about the evidence. Then we want to focus on the two key issues that featured most in the evidence in terms of impact on children, namely school closures and social distancing restrictions, whilst acknowledging that children were also impacted by many other issues which the inquiry has yet to explore, including the reduction in safeguarding protection for children in social care, the terrible conditions that children in custody had to endure, and the failure to classify children's play as exercise. Finally, we want to make some brief observations about children's rights and their enforceability before concluding. Turning to the evidence, the fact that children only featured to a limited extent in the 32 days of evidence during Module 2 is indicative of two key points we made in our opening submissions. Firstly, that children are a low political priority in an adult-centric Westminster and often invisible as far as core decision-making is concerned. And secondly, that this invisibility was exacerbated during the pandemic. Indeed, the omission of any mention of children in the inquiry's original terms of reference drafted by the government, an omission that was only corrected following a public consultation, adds further weight to the concerns of children's rights organizations about how children are often neglected and forgotten by those in power, as does the evidence of Helen McNamara, the former Deputy Cabinet Secretary, who specifically used the word invisibility when describing the government not properly considering the interests of children. The witnesses who had the most to say about children were Professor David Taylor Robinson, who gave evidence about childhood health inequality pre-pandemic, the importance of play for children and the impact of isolation on children's development, and Anne Longfield, the former Children's Commissioner for England, who gave evidence about the impact of the government's MPIs during the pandemic on children. We do not have time now to elaborate on their evidence, but we'll do so in our written closing submissions. Suffice to say that we trust My Lady will give their compelling evidence the weight it deserves when considering what the decision-makers should have done better. Another key issue for My Lady will be the extent to which you conclude that the government's response to the pandemic was affected by maverick personalities at the heart of government, including Boris Johnson himself. Whilst we do not discount the pernicious influence of Downing Street's toxic culture and lack of diversity, merely eliminating these problems will not embed the change that is necessary to avoid another deficient and dysfunctional pandemic response. Far greater structural change is needed than that. Consequently, whilst we recognize that the emails, WhatsApp messages, and diary entries provide a unique, contemporaneous insight into what powerful individuals believed privately, as opposed to what they proclaimed publicly, we ask My Lady not to allow this material that has attracted enormous media attention to assume undue importance and distract My Lady from the more fundamental systemic problems that plagued the government's response to the pandemic. To be blunt, it was the barrel that was rotten and not just the odd apple. In this regard, the evidence of the key political decision-makers, Michael Gove, Matt Hancock, Boris Johnson, and Rishi Sunak, was telling. Lots of smoke and mirrors, lots of diplomatic non-answers, lots of blaming others, lots of I cannot remember. Whilst it's entirely a matter for you, My Lady, we say all four were unconvincing. They gave insincere apologies. They were primarily interested in defending their own reputations. They were quick, even when admitting a mistake, to fall back on an excuse or qualification that sought to deflect responsibility onto the scientists or suggest that it is easy to be wise after the fact. It was all so unsatisfactory. Our focus now will be on Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, as they were particularly relevant as far as children are concerned. Michael Gove was prone to digressing and answering a totally different question to the one he was asked. On one occasion, when he went off on another tangent, Mr. Keith understandably got irritated, interrupted him, and tried to rein him in. My Lady had to intervene to calm things down. On another occasion, Mr. Gove told Mr. Keith that he was concerned that the government did not pay enough attention to the impact on children of some of its measures. However, when I asked him for an example of such a measure, he changed the goalposts and spoke instead of the uncomfortable trade-offs that the government had to make to avoid the NHS being overwhelmed. I also asked Mr. Gove who in the cabinet had primary responsibility to consider the impact of MPIs on children. His answer was everybody was concerned about children. My Lady, it is not and has never been our contention, regardless of our criticism of government, that nobody in government cared about children. Our criticism is that in the myriad of complex decisions that must inevitably be made during a crisis, it is easy for government to take an adult-centric approach, resulting in children being marginalized. If children are everybody's responsibility, as Mr. Gove intimated, they are effectively nobody's priority. That is the problem. Boris Johnson, although reluctant during his evidence to take responsibility for many of the more glaring mistakes that were made by his government during the pandemic, did make 3 significant concessions in answer to my questions. Firstly, he confirmed that he had recognized in March 2020, as opposed to with the benefit of hindsight, that school closures were very damaging for children, particularly children from lower income backgrounds, in terms of their development, socialization, educational attainment, life chances, physical health, and psychological well-being. Secondly, he accepted that the government was unprepared in March 2020 for schools to be closed for as long as they were. And thirdly, he acknowledged that although children have fewer health risks from COVID than adults, particularly older and more vulnerable adults, they suffer disproportionately from the government's MPIs, both in the short and the long term. Unfortunately, Mr. Johnson's government failed to learn the necessary lessons from the first wave of the pandemic and the first lockdown, and the consequences were dire, as we now know, in terms of further waves of infection and death, further lockdowns, and further school closures. This was perhaps the government's greatest failing. Finally, no summary of the evidence in respect of children would be complete without a postscript on Rishi Sunak and his evasive evidence about the campaign for free school meals during the holidays spearheaded by Marcus Rashford. Mr. Sunak was keen, when questioned by Mr. Keith, to disassociate himself from the entry in Sir Patrick Vallance's diary for the 13th of June 2021 that Mr. Sunak and the Chief Whip had said, and I quote, "Good working people pay for their children to eat and don't want freeloaders," end quote. However, when I asked him what his view in 2020 was on the government funding free school meals, he said he could not recall. When I asked him whether in June 2021 he was opposed to free school meals, he again said he could not recall. And yet, it is a matter of public record that in October 2020, Rishi Sunak voted against free school meals during the holidays in the House of Commons, as did Boris Johnson, Matt Hancock, and Michael Gove. What is perhaps more controversial, we appreciate, of course, is the alleged freeloader comment, and whether the government chief scientific advisor has accurately portrayed in his diary the true sentiments expressed by Mr. Sunak on this matter.
I'm going to stop you there, Mr. Menon. This is not an issue that we explored in any great detail. You have permission to ask the questions that you asked, but as far as this module is concerned, I'm afraid I'm going to stop you. This is bordering on becoming party political, and I think I've made my position perfectly plain. Could you please move to what is your next point?
I'm moving on. Turning next to the vexed topic of school closures. I wish to make it clear that we are not advocating a libertarian position that schools should never be closed for most children during a crisis. On the contrary, it is the duty of a responsible government to close schools as a last resort if such a radical intervention is necessary to save lives. Indeed, given the absence in the UK in March 2020 of any system of mass testing, robust contact tracing, and strict isolation of those with COVID, the government had little choice but to close schools as the number of COVID infections and deaths began to rise dramatically. In fact, if schools had been closed a few weeks earlier than they were, it is likely they could have reopened earlier, perhaps in May or June, as opposed to in September. The primary problem in respect of school closures in March 2020 is that there was no proper plan, no clearly established framework, no guidance for schools on remote education, and no arrangements in place for delivering face-to-face education to vulnerable children and the children of key workers under the new social distancing restrictions. And then to make matters worse, despite the valiant efforts of schools and teachers, the government failed to implement measures that sufficiently mitigated the widespread harm caused to children by the closure of schools and the cancellation of exams. Instead of schools being the first to reopen after the first lockdown, they were the last to reopen, precedence being given to non-essential retail, hospitality, and cultural venues. Rishi Sunak was plainly wrong when he told the inquiry that schools reopened before hospitality. Only certain year groups went back to school in June before hospitality reopened in July. Most children only returned to school in September. If the government had not been reckless after the first lockdown by easing restrictions for economic reasons that inevitably sparked a second wave of infection and death, it is likely that schools would not have had to be closed for a second time in January 2021, thus compounding the enduring harm caused to children. Even those who might be forgiving of the government for its inaction and complacency in early 2020 on the grounds that COVID was a largely unknown virus, would struggle to find any excuse for the failure of the government to learn lessons from the increased scientific knowledge available by the autumn of 2020 and make contingency plans in case schools had to be closed again. It was an utter shambles when schools opened for a day on the 4th of January 2021 before closing the very next day for 3 months, and exams were cancelled for a second year. It was not just school closures that caused harm to children. The failure of the government to exempt younger children in England from the social distancing restrictions in the summer of 2020, as Scotland did in July for children under 12 and Wales did in September for children under 11, caused additional harm to younger children. Anne Longfield was calling for younger children to be exempt. Children's rights organizations and child psychologists in England were calling for younger children to be exempt. And yet when I asked Michael Gove, Matt Hancock, and Boris Johnson about this, none of them could give a credible answer as to why England followed a more draconian approach towards children than Scotland and Wales. Furthermore, it was unclear whether any of them even appreciated that the social distancing restrictions in England disproportionately affected younger children who could not leave their homes unsupervised. Michael Gove seemed to say it was because the government would have been advised by the CMO, the GCSA, or others that children could spread COVID as easily as adults, including asymptomatically. However, he could not recall who specifically provided the relevant scientific advice. Furthermore, whilst claiming to be worried about children transmitting COVID whilst playing outside with their friends, he did not apparently have similar concerns about adults transmitting COVID while hunting, shooting, or playing an outdoor sport. Matt Hancock said that although consideration was given to exempting younger children from the restrictions, the government decided against it because clinicians raised concerns about increased transmission between children from different households playing with each other and between the adults who were supervising the children. When I asked him which clinicians, as the inquiry has heard no confirmation from a non-politician about such concerns, Mr. Hancock said he recalled a conversation with the CMO and a WhatsApp message in which the CMO expressed concerns about parents on the touchline. This will be a matter that my lady will wish to explore in the future module on children and education, but for present purposes, we've been unable to locate any evidence to support Mr. Hancock's contention. Boris Johnson said he would have to look back at the discussions, but his instinct was that the government wanted to minimize the risk of transmission. When I pressed him as to why England had taken a divergent approach to Scotland and Wales, he said, and I quote, "I'm not certain in future we would want to do it that way," end quote. The inquiry may wish to explore in modules 2A and 2B whether there's any evidence that Scotland and Wales exempting younger children from their social distancing restrictions increased the transmission of COVID. We are unaware of any such evidence. Turning then to children's rights and their enforceability, this is a huge topic which we will develop further in our written closing submissions. The short point we wish to make now is that although children have rights and not just interests under UK and international law, these rights were insufficiently considered by high-level political decision makers during the pandemic. Consequently, many children were deprived of their right to education, their right to play, and their right to live free from harm. To recover, they need far more support than they are currently receiving from the state to redress the years of lost learning, lost freedoms, and lost hope. and they need the enforceability of their rights to be placed on a statutory footing. In conclusion, my lady, we return to the 9 recommendations which we set out in our written opening submissions and which we will address in detail in our written closing submissions, but do not repeat now given the time constraints. The children's rights organizations we represent have given great thought to what fundamental structural changes are necessary for children not to be neglected again in a future crisis. Their recommendations, which we commend to you, my lady, seek to fix the underlying causes of the mistakes made during the COVID pandemic, as opposed to making blanket recommendations on specific issues that may be irrelevant in a future crisis that is very different from the COVID pandemic. If followed and implemented, the recommendations will ensure, we submit, that children's rights are embedded in future decision-making, the government fully takes the best interests of children into account, the COVID generation of children is properly supported, and their contribution to overcoming the pandemic is honored. We must, as a nation, take decisive action now to prevent a generation of children and young people being defined forever by their experience of the COVID pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Menon. And as you've acknowledged, but I'm going to repeat, I've said it before, I very much intend to ensure that the impact on children is fully investigated. It'll be at a different level in this module, but as you know, later in the inquiry, we'll make sure that they are properly covered. So thank you. Ms Davis. Oh, there you are. Can't see the green light yet.
Got it. Thank you very much, my lady. Thank you. As you know, my lady, I appear for Southall Black Sisters and Solace Women's Aid, together with Marina Surjadis, Fatima Jishi, Ubadiri and Angharab Monk, and we're instructed by Public Interest Law Centre. My lady, we know that there was a rise in domestic abuse in 2020, and we know that rise was foreseen and was a direct result of the MPIs implemented by government. So the issue is not what the government did, but what it failed to do and what it could and should have done to make a material difference to victims, predominantly women, experiencing domestic abuse. We say there were 5 main failures. A failure to be prepared well in advance of the first lockdown, a failure to get the messaging right despite requests, a failure to consider, let alone implement, an exception to the regulations that would have allowed people to provide a safe place to those fleeing domestic abuse, a failure to ensure that all victims of domestic abuse had access to support when the government refused to suspend no recourse to public funds, and a failure to learn lessons from the first lockdown when it came to the second and third lockdown. In terms of what was done, namely funding to frontline services and holding the Hidden Harms Summit, we say that this was too little and too late. Whilst the You Are Not Alone campaign by the Home Office was a welcome move, it was late, relatively short-lived, and without parallel messaging from the whole of government, its impact was lost. Underlying all these failures, we say, was a failure to consult early on with the domestic abuse sector as to what they needed. My lady, the background to these failures is a culture of either indifference or, as you have heard, misogyny at the very heart of government. But that in itself, while shocking and leading to narrow decision-making, is not a sufficient explanation. Government as a whole has responsibility for tackling domestic abuse. That responsibility lies primarily with the Home Office, but also with what was then the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, MHCLG, and the Ministry of Justice. None of those departments anticipated the rise in domestic abuse or the need to plan for it. They all reacted too late. And that shows a lack of attention to domestic abuse and indifference to domestic abuse at a corporate level, not solely explained by the misogyny and indifference which we've seen from central senior decision makers. It is an institutional failure which led to many women facing 2 risks to their health, from COVID and from domestic abuse. And indeed, in the case of women subject to no recourse to public funds, 3 risks because they also face destitution. We say that for future pandemics, government must consult at an early stage with the domestic abuse sector and must include domestic abuse in its pandemic planning. My lady, you heard oral testimony from Rebecca Goshawk from Solace Women's Aid, and you have written evidence from her and from Hanana Siddiqui from Southall Black Sisters. Some personal accounts from women are contained in the 2 witness statements and in the aptly named report exhibited in the witness statements from Solace Women's Aid. When I needed you to protect me, you gave him more power instead. Let me read just 2 of those accounts of what life was like in the double prison of lockdown and of domestic abuse. Raina, whose story is in Hanana Siddiqui's witness statement, says, "It was most horrible at the time. I was always inside the house. He never let me go to the park for a walk. He did leave the house to go for a walk. I was 24/7 inside the house, confined to my room. Even using the washroom and kitchen was a task for me. I took one of my kids in the kitchen so I could cook in peace," pausing because otherwise she would have been abused while cooking. "I didn't have a choice for the whole of COVID. I was only confined to my room. I became mute. I was so depressed and I didn't feel like talking. There were constant fights because of him being around all the time. It made me so anxious. I was living in a nightmare without end. COVID for me was a nightmare." He refused to let her use her phone. And to emphasise the triple abuse experienced by women who are migrants, "All my documents are with him. Till date, my passport and everything is with him, me and my sons. He hasn't given them to us." The second account is in When I Needed You to Protect Me, and makes the point that abuse increased partly because of the physical restriction of lockdown, but also because abusers turned their fear of the virus against women. When the Covid-19 pandemic began, her perpetrator insisted on her isolating in her room for a week after being outside of the house for mere minutes. Later, he assaulted me to get me out of the kitchen because he didn't want me to be around the food that he'd just cooked. I told him how scared I was. He didn't care, you know, he just saw me as an object. We know from Goshawk and Siddiqui and the documents they produce, including the call for evidence from another 12 domestic abuse organisations exhibited to Siddiqui's statement, that there was an extraordinary increase in demand for domestic abuse services, that traditional methods to find support, such as speaking privately with GPs at medical appointments, were not available. There was not the school support or social worker visiting. It was difficult to access statutory services, such as homelessness or social services. And of course, women could not stay with or even visit family or friends. We also know that the nature of domestic abuse worsened during lockdown. More women reported the use of weapons, including knives. Women described being locked in bathrooms or bedrooms at home, as you've just heard. They described being prevented from using phones or computers to communicate. So they were cut off from their family and friends, something which is deeply controlling and in lockdown is deeply isolating. So lockdown was a lonely, frightening and dangerous experience. The domestic abuse sector was having to deal with the extra demand and the additional complexity of cases in circumstances where their funding had been substantially cut over the previous 10 years, leaving many of them operating on a shoestring, and with the most serious cuts made to the smaller providers, including the by and for providers, mainly those by and for black and ethnic minority women. Together, of course, with having to reorganise their service provision so that workers could work from home and could support their frontline workers who were managing their own health, households and their crucial work. My lady, the rise in domestic abuse and in the intensity of abuse experienced is still being witnessed and dealt with by the domestic abuse sector today. The impact of domestic abuse does not end when lockdown ends or even when the pandemic ends. Let me turn to the 5 failures. The first failure to be prepared in advance of the first lockdown. The evidence has shown that an increase in domestic abuse was not just foreseeable, but was actually foreseen once social isolation and lockdown were contemplated. You have that from accounts in the press from other countries, from Martin Hewitt's evidence that it was self-evident that lockdown was going to put vulnerable people at risk, and from Dame Jenny Harris, who was aware that women were calling helplines once lockdown was anticipated, even before it was implemented. We also know that government was warned. By mid-March, domestic abuse charities were campaigning about the risk of increase in domestic abuse. On the 19th of March, the Victims Commissioner and the Equality and Human Rights Commission both wrote to the Prime Minister, and the Domestic Abuse Commissioner wrote to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. They warned of the likely increase in domestic abuse and asked for increased funding to meet this anticipated surge in demand. And it seems to have been those letters, together with a more public campaign, that sparked the Home Office and MHCLG into some action. And we know that from two memos, which are the first documents referring to the need for government assistance, particularly funding and messaging. They're on the 25th of March within the MHCLG, and on the 26th of March, a memo from Home Office officials to the Home Secretary and the Minister for Safeguarding. So that's when government starts to plan. 2 to 3 days after full lockdown is announced and implemented. 10 days after social isolation is recommended on the 16th of March. A month from the 28th of February, when government departments are told to plan from the pandemic, or early March, when the scientists start to talk about suppression. You heard Dame Priti Patel's evidence that she and Martin Hewitt were regularly discussing domestic abuse from early March. That may be the case. We don't have the notes of those meetings. But if they were, the delay in not starting to formulate a plan until the 26th of March is even more concerning. Second failure, lack of consistent and clear messaging. Clarity of messaging is an important part of MPIs. Boris Johnson said messaging was the most important tool we had to deal with the virus. The regulations, including the exemptions to the stay-at-home requirement, needed to be clearly and consistently communicated. Very soon into lockdown, the domestic abuse sector was concerned that it was not clear that women at risk of domestic abuse could leave. The Domestic Abuse Commissioner made that point on the Today programme on the 31st of March. The Home Office took some steps. Dame Priti wrote in the Mail on Sunday on the 29th of March. The You Are Not Alone campaign was launched on the 11th of April, when Dame Priti and Martin Hewitt did the daily press briefing at Downing Street. But we say that the message was not explicit enough. The guidance used the phrase from the regulations, escape risk of injury or harm, and did not specifically mention domestic abuse. We say it should have done, and should also have made it clear that women leaving in those circumstances could take their children. Dame Jenny Harris said in evidence, "I'm not sure that if I was somebody frightened, in a domestic abuse situation and about to go into lockdown, that I would perhaps have clocked that the message that says for an emergency actually applied to me." We say the most egregious failure of messaging was the lack of consistency across government, and notably in the Prime Minister's and Deputy Prime Minister's addresses to the nation when announcing lockdown or the continuation of lockdowns. My lady, you've heard that none of the Prime Minister's 4 addresses during 2020 announcing lockdown mentioned domestic abuse as a lawful reason to leave home. On the 23rd of March, he listed 4 exceptions, none referring to the risk of injury or harm. And he compounded that omission by saying, that's all. Those are the only reasons why you should leave your home. He finally mentioned domestic abuse on the 4th of January 2021, after an advisor had flagged up that afternoon that his speech should make it clear, saying we get kicked every time for not saying it. Dominic Raab's response, when asked why domestic abuse was not included, was that there was limited time. We say that is dismissive. An additional short sentence takes a couple of seconds. Boris Johnson, on the other hand, said that in retrospect, it probably should have been made explicit. Dame Priti Patel's evidence was that she and her department had raised the issue with Mr. Johnson. He did not remember her raising it. In short, while messaging was developed by the Home Office, it was done so under pressure and was late. The regulations and guidance were not sufficiently clear, and government messaging, particularly the important addresses from the Prime Minister, was not consistent. The third failure, a gap in the regulations. Matt Hancock confirmed that the exemption to the requirement to stay at home, that a person could leave if they were victim of crime or at risk of injury or harm, was intended to include domestic abuse. We say that a parallel position, to which no thought was given, was equally necessary. That parallel position is for an exemption to permit friends or family to offer a person escaping abuse a temporary place to stay, an informal safe haven. My lady, you've heard our point that this is something that is normal. A sister or mother or friend offers a spare room or sofa. It was all the more necessary in lockdown, given that refuges were at capacity and were turning women away. Hancock's evidence was that had such a proposal been put to him, he would have seriously considered it and would have been inclined to agree. We recognise that this proposal requires scientific advice, but we do suggest that for future pandemics, the opportunity of an individual providing a temporary place to stay to someone escaping abuse is at least considered. The fourth failure, not protecting migrant women subject to domestic abuse. You have the point, my lady, that those subject to no recourse to public funds who were being abused underwent a triple lock of domestic abuse, of lockdown, and of the structural barriers to leaving in the form of destitution. These women have no access to welfare benefits or housing and homelessness assistance. At a time of public health emergency, the humanitarian measure would have been to suspend NRPF, so that women fleeing domestic abuse could know that they would not be destitute. They could claim welfare benefits, have the opportunity of a refuge place, or obtain homelessness assistance from the council. Government was lobbied extensively to suspend NRPF during the pandemic, not just from the domestic abuse sector, but also from the Mayor of London, Labour and SNP MPs, the Domestic Abuse and Victims Commissioners, the Local Government Association and Liberty. Despite that, government took a clear policy decision not to suspend NRPF. Dame Pretty's response when we asked her was to say that it was legally challenging to suspend and then to go back and reinstate. We say that government took several extraordinary steps in the pandemic for public health reasons, not least the everyone in instruction that all those sleeping rough should be given emergency accommodation regardless of immigration status. It cannot have been beyond government to take this step. Deciding not to suspend NRPF, we say, was not a legal decision, it was a political decision. It was part of the government's hostile environment, which it was not willing to compromise on, even during a public health emergency. Before I turn to the fifth failure, let me deal with the issue of funding for refugees and other domestic abuse support services. Government was extensively lobbied from the end of March and throughout April, not just by the domestic abuse sector, but also by the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, the Mayor of London, and others for additional funding. On the 27th of April, a month into lockdown, there were three significant events. The House of Commons Home Affairs Committee issued a devastating report on Home Office preparedness for coronavirus, domestic abuse and the risks of harm within the home. And I say that not to impeach or question it, but simply to refer to its publicly available contents. Public Interest Law Centre, acting on behalf of Southall Black Sisters and Solace Women's Aid, sent a letter before claim to the MHCLG threatening judicial review. And over 750 people sent emails to Priti Patel and Robert Jenrick. The Home Office had provided £2 million on the 11th of April when it launched its You Are Not Alone campaign. But more substantial funding was not announced until the 2nd of May, when 76 million was announced, of which 27 million was earmarked for the domestic abuse sector. We say that announcement was a direct result of campaigning by the domestic abuse sector, of the threat of legal action and of the Home Office Affairs Committee's report. We asked Dame Pretty about that, particularly the threat of legal action, and she said she could not give a categorical response. We do note, and we'll give you details in our written submissions, of an MHCLG submission to the Minister on the 5th of May, which refers explicitly to the threat of judicial review. Even that money announced on the 2nd of May did not start to be allocated until the 19th of June and only came through around July. The point is, my lady, that although funding was requested before lockdown started from the 19th of March, it did not reach domestic abuse organisations during the first lockdown at all in March, April, May or June. And so those organisations, already chronically underfunded from 10 years of austerity cuts, spent the whole of the first lockdown struggling with unprecedented demand and insufficient resources. And I should add that domestic abuse workers were not automatically treated as key workers. They faced struggles for PPE, testing, and even access to early vaccination. The fifth and final failure, my lady, is the failure to learn lessons from the first lockdown. Boris Johnson made a point in his witness statement of saying that lessons had been learned, specifically about domestic abuse and child abuse, and the government wanted to ensure that services supporting women and children remained available and steps were taken to tackle these crimes. When asked what steps were taken, he responded with the Ask for Annie scheme, which came into effect in February 2021, and the Domestic Abuse Bill. While what is now the Domestic Abuse Act is very welcome, it did not receive royal assent until April 2021 and only started to come into force from July 2021. And so it is not an answer to what steps were taken to protect women during the second and third lockdowns from the first lockdown. Lessons were not learned by government from the first lockdown. My lady, we will submit detailed recommendations for you in our written submissions, but we say that crucially, government failed to consult early on with the violence against women and girls sector, and that was a mistake that should not be repeated in the future. Above all, my lady, in another pandemic, victims of domestic abuse should not be left without support, isolated, lonely, frightened and abused. And preventing that abuse needs to be a government priority and not an afterthought. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Ms Davis. Right, it's now Mr Jacobs.
Thank you, my lady. These are the closing submissions on behalf of the Trades Union Congress. I appear with Miss Ruby Peacock and we are instructed by Thompson Solicitors. In this module, the TUC is working in partnership with the Welsh TUC, the Scottish TUC and the Northern Ireland Committee of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. The TUC and its sister organisations seek to be the voice of those at work. That has been our aim in this module and will be the focus of our closing submissions. My lady, by way of preliminary observation, the themes upon which we will address you will be familiar. Centrally, we suggest that the themes of our previous submissions to you, as to disproportionate impacts in the workplace, as to financial support for self-isolation, as to paucity of consultation, and so on, have only been strengthened by the evidence as it has emerged. There is a wealth of evidence as to occupational exposure being a significant risk factor in the transmission of the virus, and of occupational exposure intersecting with socio-economic inequalities. Independent Sage reported that people in the lowest paid occupations are twice as likely as those in higher occupational groups to die from COVID-19. Professor Ferguson explained that the poorest in society had the least ability to comply with measures, to work from home, and were most exposed to the virus. The documents which record high-level decision-making do refer on numerous occasions to the particular impact on vulnerable groups of certain sectors being closed, retail and hospitality being often cited examples. That was certainly an important consideration. Jobs and livelihoods are fundamental to well-being. The blind spot, we say, was a lack of focus on safety for those who were attending work. Disproportionate transmission and deaths within vulnerable groups arose ultimately in those who were attending work rather than those who were not. It is right to acknowledge that some of the causes of unsafe workplaces are structural and pre-existing. As considered in Module 1, stretched health services and stretched and fragmented social care services are a fault line. More broadly, we have described before the relevance of a working population that has a growing proportion in low-income work and in insecure work. That view finds strong support in the work of the SAGE Ethnicity subgroup, which is before you in this module. We also mention again, in brief passing, the pre-existing paucity of health and safety enforcement by an underfunded HSE and overburdened local authorities. The inquiry has now heard evidence of the government grappling after the first lockdown with the difficult balance of returning to work within the R budget. Safe workplaces would have made the aim of returning to work so much more achievable and less deadly. In the event, the return to work was managed against a vacuum of enforcement. We remind you, my lady, of our view that it is an important issue for future modules in this inquiry. An issue that this module has grappled with is financial support for self-isolation. The context is one of low sick pay provision. As the Chancellor was briefed during the pandemic by his advisers within the Treasury, the UK has the lowest sick pay provision amongst all OECD countries. This issue was alluded to in oral evidence by Mr Hancock, who spoke of his own wish that statutory sick pay be doubled. When the pandemic arrived, the inadequacy of sick pay provision provided the most obvious disincentive to compliance with self-isolation, particularly amongst low-income and vulnerable groups. Of course, those we represent campaign vociferously on the issue, but it is now apparent that a number close to the centre of government were making the very same call for action. Several witnesses, it appears to us, have spoken quite passionately about the issue. They were struck by the comparatively disadvantaged experiences of those on poorer incomes who were working at greater risk to keep the country going. The assiduously diplomatic Professor Whitty described heated debate on the issue. It is evident that there was a real roadblock, namely the Treasury and the Chancellor in particular. That is particularly evident in Sir Patrick's diaries, not least in the reference to Simon Case's advice given to the Prime Minister that you will need to persuade Rishi personally. Mr Sunak's oral evidence that financial support for self-isolation was not relevant early in the pandemic, as test and trace had not got going, was revealing. For the many thousands in low-paid, high-risk jobs who never stopped working, self-isolation was a crucially important safety measure from day one onwards, but one that was hugely difficult without support. It is evident that it is an issue that was still not grasped. The justification by the Treasury for its opposition to greater support is with reference to survey data, which suggested that return to work was just one reason for non-compliance. My lady, breaking self-isolation to attend work was high consequence in terms of transmission of the virus, particularly for low-income sectors with high vulnerability. Someone attending to a production line in a processing plant because they are worried about the rent is highly problematic and needs addressing. And the fact that some others may break self-isolation in different ways for some other reason is really neither here nor there. We suggest that on analysis, the Treasury rationale is paper thin. The Treasury did reluctantly agree to provide funds to the Test and Trace Support Payment Scheme. However, it was devised to be a low-profile scheme with a low take-up rate, and so it proved to be. Safety at work was also hampered by a lack of meaningful consultation with sectoral partners, including unions. The evidence of those we represent is that there was some attempt at consultation, but it was perceived to fall short of meaningful engagement. The disclosure indicates that the government, at its core, was one that was dismissive of mature engagement. It is pithily summarised by Mr Johnson having stated, in the context of decision-making on return to work, that the government, quote, can't have the bollocks of consulting with employees and trade unions. When put to Mr Johnson, he said the sentiment isn't necessarily that of a Prime Minister engendering a dismissive approach to consultation. We say, what farcical nonsense. There are numerous examples of this approach festering through government decision-making, whether it's resistance to making any meaningful changes to sick pay or viewing schools as a battleground with unions. The lack of consultation also had an impact upon the quality of workplace guidance. We make no apology for being a broken record on this issue. For all the abstract acknowledgement of disproportionate impacts, which are so easy to state, it is ultimately in concrete measures such as those in relation to workplace safety that solutions can be found. All too often, workplace guidance was late, lacking in understanding of the practical realities of workplaces, and too discretionary and too generic. In April 2020, Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham wrote to Alok Sharma to urge his department to provide greater clarity in the guidance, and they warned that on social media it was awash with stories and images from unsafe workplaces, and the mayoral offices were receiving hundreds of reports of guidance being flouted. My lady, the resistance to consultation and dialogue fits a broader pattern. It is also reflected in the evidence given by those in local government, including the Metro mayors, by those in respect of the devolved administrations, and by the Children's Commissioner. This morning, Mr Freedman spoke powerfully on this very issue in respect of the disabled. It is a symptom, we would suggest, of what Helen McNamara's internal review reported, that many felt there is a belief that intellect will out, implying that a small core of people is clever enough to think their way out of the problem without support. Diversity of thought was not recognised. A vitally important lesson, we say, is the need for a mature, open form of government. Another neglected aspect of workplace safety arose out of the movement of staff between care homes. Carl Hennigan gave evidence that COVID was identified as threefold higher in staff working across different care homes. The failure to grapple with this issue at an early stage in the pandemic not only seeded the pandemic in the most vulnerable section of the population, but also contributed to the unequal impact, given the profile not only of those reliant on the sector, but also of the care sector workforce. It is clearly an issue that needs to be grappled with in future pandemic planning. We address distinctly decision-making in respect of education. The outcomes were undeniably poor. If a central aim was to keep schools open, the attempts to do so resulted ultimately in the very lengthy restrictions on attendance commencing in January 2021. For the purposes of this module, it is evident that poor outcomes were symptoms of significant flaws in the decision-making processes within central government. Coming out of the first lockdown, there was a need for careful and advanced thinking as to how reopening schools might be managed whilst keeping the R rate below 1. As Mr. Johnson expressed, schools were terrific reservoirs of the virus. At a COVID-0 meeting on the 6th of August 2020, the Department for Education presented an options paper on return to school. It might have been more ambitious in respect of its considerations of MPIs within schools, but it did consider contingencies such as local closures and rotas with the necessary advance notice to schools. Consideration was also given to managing the opening of schools within the overall R budget and the decisions that may need to be made about other sectors in order to allow schools to stay open safely. That goes to a point raised by Mr. Menon just a few moments ago. The Prime Minister's response, as recorded in Sir Patrick's diary, was an emphatic rejection of those contingencies. Don't want to hear about Plan B and C for failure. We are no longer taking this COVID excuse stuff. Get back to school. My lady, these were not simply flippant comments. They were the policy. The formal minute of the same meeting was to the same effect. It recorded the point being made that, quote, schools should not be told of a fallback plan, as it would allow them to have an excuse not to open in September. And, quote, explicit contingency plan guidance for schools should not be shared in advance to avoid undermining momentum towards a full reopening. It was hopeless as an approach, given the obvious cause for caution going into the winter. It was also a callous way to treat teachers who were, as a matter of intentional government policy, left guessing as to what any contingency planning might be and leaving them to respond on the hoof as and when late changes of the course of action were announced. My lady, it was not by accident, it was by design. The ramifications of the no Plan B approach were numerous, but they will no doubt be considered in the subsequent module on education. The quality of decision-making appears to have been further hampered by a relationship with the sector and unions in particular that not only lacked constructive collaboration, but was positively oppositional. In questions to Mr. Johnson, we asked about the policy on face masks in schools, which was obviously considered privately to be a mess, and which had been arrived at further, according to Simon Case, to a no-surrender approach of Gavin Williamson to unions, for which he had full backing from the PM. My lady, we conclude with two more general points. The first being the culture in Westminster. There is a narrative pushed by some external to this inquiry of the infighting spreading from Number 10 in particular being titillating evidence but ultimately irrelevant. My lady, we don't agree. On analysis, there are various ways in which the corrosive culture impaired and frustrated decision-making. We see key ministers being sidelined from decision-making processes, an unwillingness of civil servants to step into key roles, voices of senior civil servants being sidelined, and so on. Mr. Johnson appears to have presided over and either promoted or certainly acquiesced in that culture. We were struck, as Miss Mitchell on behalf of the Scottish bereaved were, by the words of Mr. Johnson in a WhatsApp when finally he complained to Mr. Cummings of a totally disgusting orgy of narcissism by a government that should be solving a national crisis. My lady, hear, hear. That was the honest assessment of Mr. Johnson at the time. It was the correct assessment. To some witnesses, it is just Westminster. We would suggest that resigned acceptance by some of such behaviour simply underlines the need for this inquiry to make strident findings on the issue, and in doing so to seek to effect much-needed cultural change. Finally, the timing of lockdowns. Whilst these oral hearings have focused heavily on events leading to the first lockdown, the response to subsequent waves of the infection were as deadly. Fundamentally, it was a misnomer to approach the second wave as a choice between prioritising health or the economy. No one, when it came to it, was in favour of letting it rip and seeing huge numbers of daily deaths and overwhelming of the NHS. Yet that was the trajectory as reliably predicted by the scientific advice. On a realistic and balanced analysis, the question from late September 2020 was whether to take action earlier or later. It was also known that later would mean longer. The lesson from the first lockdown had been go earlier and go harder, but the policy as implemented was to do the opposite. It cost lives and the consequences of a very lengthy later lockdown. My lady, these matters must be the subject of careful and detailed focus by the inquiry in its report. My lady, those are the submissions on behalf of the TUC and its sister organisations. They have been grateful to have the opportunity to seek to assist you in this important module of the inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Jacobs. Mr Allen.
Good afternoon, my lady. As you know, I represent the interests of the Local Government Association in this module focused on issues of governance.
Is the microphone on?
Oh, no.
It will be. Thank you. I think you probably heard me anyway.
I did.
I shall start with a word, if I may, about future modules. The LGA wishes, if possible, to be a core participant in those modules that look more deeply into social care and test and trace. And there's much more detail to be explored in relation to those topics than can be covered in this module or indeed in these closing submissions. So these submissions will not cover those issues in the depth that they will deserve in a later examination. The focus of the oral evidence for much of this module has been on the often chaotic and it seems consistently poor internal workings of national governance. But that is by no means the limit to the issue that this module has to consider about structure of governance. There are 4 basic points that my clients wish to emphasise about the oral evidence you've heard. The LGA recognises that urgent and grave policy decisions as to how to bring the country through the pandemic had to be taken centrally and under great pressure. Yet it's obvious now, and it must have been then, that no policy would be successful if it could not be delivered effectively. And at all times, through the pandemic in England, it was for local government to operationalise those policy decisions that did not directly involve hospitalisation. So to make the best policies that would neither be a muddle nor ineffective, central government engagement with local government was an absolutely necessary prerequisite for good governance. 3 issues follow. Did such engagement happen? If not, why not? And in preparing now for the possibility of another pandemic, what recommendations should you make to ensure a better connection between policy making and operational delivery? Did proper engagement happen? In short, no. The detail of the LGA's perspective is set out in its former chief executive, Mark Lloyd's witness statement. There are many examples of when it could have been done better that you've also heard from in this oral evidence, and we shall reprise some of those. Consider first the evidence from 3 city mayors who should have been crucial partners of government: London's Sadiq Khan, Greater Manchester's Andy Burnham, and Liverpool's Steve Rotherham. Each gave compelling evidence showing the disconnect between policy and operations. Mr. Khan made multiple requests to attend COBRA meetings, but was never invited by government on the grounds that other mayors and leaders would also have to be present. Mr. Burnham, who'd previously chaired swine flu COBRA meetings, pointed out how attendance would have provided a structured environment where serious issues could have been properly raised, such as financial support for affected workers. He also said he asked the government for patient-identifiable data of people who tested positive for COVID, but this was refused for weeks and weeks and weeks. Mr. Rotherham told you of his shock to discover in the early stages of the pandemic, only through the news, that those repatriated from Wuhan would be isolating in his area. The central theme of their oral evidence, non-engagement, played out during the pandemic across the whole of local government. Thus, all 3 first learned about major COVID updates affecting their cities only after seeing them in the news. Likewise, as a whole, councils learnt about new policies and guidance at the same time as members of the public, when the televised 5 p.m. daily briefings were broadcast. Requiring policy implementation before the necessary structures and support mechanisms are in place was bound to be futile in securing a full, effective implementation, which could be explained and justified locally. Next, look at data management and its use. In our world, the best use of available data is key to good governance. Yet data sharing was a key challenge in the early stages. The ability of local government to establish effective data sharing protocols varied significantly across England and indeed in the devolved nations. On this, the module heard from Gavin Freegard, who spoke about local government feeling central government didn't understand what data might be needed, how it might be used, or its full benefits. Even before the pandemic, he spoke of hearing many concerns that data sharing was very much a one-way relationship, and councils are not supplied with information that could be valuable to them in running their local areas. And this problem played out during the pandemic. Local government could complement the national system rather than duplicate or compete with it, but to do that, it needed to be fully engaged. We have indeed given much written evidence about this in Mark Lloyd's second witness statement. Take also the evidence about tiering. Many today have made reference to that already, and you will recall how Boris Johnson, deciding against a circuit breaker lockdown in September 2020, preferred a regional 3-tier system to be operationalised in England from the 14th of October 2020. But this occurred without proper engagement with local government. And so you had the evidence from Michael Gove saying that the tiering system was inherently flawed and that he grew more sceptical about its efficacy. Matt Hancock said about Tier 3, "I was in despair that we'd announced a policy that we knew would not work." And even in his evidence, Mr. Johnson quickly acknowledged this policy ran out of road and that we didn't achieve it. Look also at the interface between police and local government on the issue of enforcement. Martin Hewitt, then chair of the National Police Chiefs Council, instanced an occasion when Mr. Hancock signed off the exact wording of new regulations at 11:46 p.m. when police officers were expected to enforce this 16 minutes later at 12:01. Local government was equally out of the loop, though expected to support the operationalisation of the regulations. Look also at test and trace and isolate. The evidence on TTI provides a paradigm of the consequences of policy made without operational input. It is simply extraordinary. Mr. Johnson should have said that he was initially told the UK was well covered and had ample preparations and a very good test and trace system by the contracted system. It was simply not true. The contracted system was not only way off the mark, but developed in complete ignorance of the capacity of local government. As the LGA's former Chief Executive Mark Lloyd has said in his witness statement, councils have deep knowledge of their local communities, their local health and social care system, and had the skills to support and make contact tracing work. Yet they were not engaged from the outset, even though environmental health officers and public health specialists had been doing this for many years. Only as the pandemic progressed was there increasing recognition of the vital value of local leadership when directors of public health, chief executives and civic leaders were brought in to provide that perspective. They were then able to inform the development of local outbreak plans that ensure the challenges of Covid-19 were understood and addressed. Consider also the evidence of Age UK Director Caroline Abrams. She re-emphasised what she called the strong words in her witness statement, that the government's response to the first wave was deeply ineffective because of policymakers' complete misunderstanding of what happens in care homes. She spoke of the long time for policymakers to respond to the reality of people living in care homes, often having very significant health issues, supported by too few staff. She also said of the hesitation on the part of government to intervene or to provide support to services which were predominantly provided by the private or voluntary sector, contrasting this with the steps the government took to protect the NHS. Why was this? It would seem this is likely to be the consequence of a long-term neglect of the realities of this sector. This you will consider in a later module, we know. And for now, the LGA asks you to recall how Professor Watson noted that the cuts to social care funding before the pandemic reduced the capacity of local authority services to provide social care and support, and how Professor Shakespeare noted that funding pressures on councils contributed to linked pressures on fee levels for care providers, leading to fewer staff and unmet need in the period before the pandemic. There can be no doubt that the significant and sustained funding pressures facing adult social care and support stymied its ability to respond effectively when the pandemic arrived. But we also remind you that Caroline Abrams said that it was the arrival of Sir David Pearson to sort out the government's response to social care as being the single biggest reason things got better. His involvement was so significant because Sir David, as a former director of adult social services and indeed a former president of the Association of Directors of Adult Social Services, brought real local government experience on the operationalisation of these issues. And so to my last question, why was there not the necessary engagement with local government? There seems to have been a multitude of evasions about this, from blaming local government itself to blaming the dysfunctional way the centre of government worked during the pandemic. But it won't do to blame local government. The LGA stood ready at every stage to input directly and to convene experts to support policy making. Mr. Lloyd's first witness statements are 111 pages long, and many of them demonstrate exactly this point. And in any event, it's up to central government to get the information necessary to make good policy. Its failure was to ignore council's special role in the community. Yet every central government should know that local councils with local knowledge and local community relations play an essential part in public life. In the US, they say that all politics is local, and it's as true here as there. When it comes to dealing with authority, people tend to trust their local council rather than national, remote-sounding bodies, because they relate to their area and circumstances, what's going on in their street or neighbourhood. Putting it more positively, the LGA submits it was essential to understand what local councils could already do well and how they could be helped to do it even better in the face of the new social pressures and extra demands during the pandemic. And so here are the LGA's recommendations for future good governance. First, it must be recognised that in a pandemic, locally driven processes and responses will be more speedy and better designed to secure the necessary coordination and collaboration between agencies. By contrast, centrally prescribed top-down policy lacking such local involvement will always be suboptimal. So local organisations that should always be brought into the policy making as soon as possible to inform and, where possible, help to co-design national decisions. First among these is the LGA, being the only association which can speak for all authorities and which covers all bases. There are important other relevant, more specialist representative organisations, such as the Association of Directors of Public Health and the Associations of Directors of Adult and Children's Social Services, who should also be involved. Local government must be represented at the highest level, in COBRA. Of course, COBRA meetings should not be too big, and so cannot have all councils as members. But the LGA, with its width of membership and long experience in disseminating policy, can provide that representation. Where necessary, subgroups could include leaders or mayors of specific councils. Improved engagement in this way would help optimise key decisions, such as the proper balance between the needs of the NHS and of the social care sector, and the arrangements for the flow of essential data and intelligence from national agencies to local public health teams. It would also improve transparency and the timely and effective communication of central government policies as they develop during a future pandemic. My lady, many more technical recommendations have been made in Mr. Lloyd's witness statement, which I shall not repeat, but urge you to adopt. And so, my lady, the LGA thanks you for the opportunity to participate in this module so as to bring the concerns of local government for the future good governance of any future pandemic to the fore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Allen. We'll break now. I shall return at 3:15.
All rise.
Mr. Stanton.
Thank you, my lady. This statement on behalf of the British Medical Association focuses on the impacts of government decisions on doctors and healthcare workers. The BMA recognises that a pandemic will necessarily be challenging for healthcare and public health systems and their staff. However, the scale and severity of the impact of COVID-19 was not inevitable and was made worse by poor government decisions. The UK government was slow to act, too quick to ease protections. It failed to adopt a precautionary approach, failed to adequately consider the impact of decisions on those at greatest risk, and its response to the pandemic was significantly hampered and restricted by a lack of NHS and public health capacity. Regarding NHS capacity, The inquiry has heard a lot of evidence across modules 1 and 2 about the importance of NHS capacity in responding to a pandemic. The response of Sajid Javid to your question, my lady, about lessons learned typifies this shared view. He said, quote, "In responding to a pandemic, your available health capacity has a big determinant. We don't have many beds per head in the UK. In England, for example, it's around 100,000. If you look at countries like Germany, France, other comparable countries, they have more than double, triple, sometimes quadruple the number of beds that we've got. Similar for ventilators, ventilator units, ICU units, doctors and nurses per head. NHS capacity is absolutely key to dealing with the next pandemic," close quote. Similarly, the inquiry's summary of references to the likely impact of the pandemic on the NHS within government meetings and communications between the 14th of February and 22nd of March demonstrates the significance of this issue. There are 47 references to NHS capacity in March alone, including the compelling evidence from the 22nd of March that in the worst case scenario, ITU capacity in London would be overwhelmed in just 9 days. This rapidly deteriorating position and the limited available capacity forced the hand of decision makers. The 16th of March measures might have succeeded in bringing down the R number, but the NHS was so close to being overwhelmed that there was no time to wait and assess their impact. And the UK went into a mandatory lockdown a week later. Within this system that was already stretched to breaking point, doctors and healthcare workers were vulnerable and exposed. They were described as the canary in the coal mine because they are the first group to be infected, and their risk of infection was 6 times greater than in the general population. They are the essential component of the NHS, without which numbers of ICU and hospital beds are meaningless, and yet they were inadequately protected throughout. The failure to provide adequate protection against the risks of aerosol transmission is an issue of serious and ongoing concern, and one which the BMA has repeatedly raised before the inquiry. Despite it being predictable in February that the virus would transmit by aerosol, the requirement of FFP3 respirators when treating patients with COVID-19 was downgraded in March to fluid-resistant surgical masks, which do not protect from airborne transmission and are not PPE. And this remains the position in England today. The evidence of Professor Catherine Noakes supports the view that aerosol transmission was overlooked in favour of droplet transmission. Paragraph 10.11 of her witness statement suggests a number of reasons for the reluctance to fully acknowledge this risk, including the significant resource and operational implications for hospital infection and control measures. It is perplexing that, just at the point when airborne transmission was becoming more widely acknowledged, a stop order was placed on further procurement of FFP3 respirators from the 30th of June 2020, when a July 2020 survey by the BMA found that shortages of respirators remained. The failure to adequately respond to the risk of aerosol transmission has had a direct impact on the protection of healthcare workers, with 40% of respondents to a BMA survey reporting as late as July 2021 that they were not being provided with respirators, despite working with COVID-19 patients. In this regard, the BMA invites the inquiry to consider the extent to which considerations of cost and practicality were prioritised over safety. There is also little evidence that the potential personal impacts on doctors and other healthcare workers were considered by decision makers. All too often, the risks to the NHS were characterised as organisational. For example, references to the NHS becoming overwhelmed or the need to save the NHS, without consideration of the personal circumstances and risks taken by the people who work in it. This tendency can be seen in an email chain between Number 10 and the Cabinet Office over the 13th and 14th of April, referred to in the evidence of Simon Ridley and since published by the inquiry. The emails raised concerns at reports that 20% of infections and 10% of deaths were due to infections acquired in hospitals, and that while by this time the R number had been brought below 1 within the community, it was still above 1 in hospitals and care homes. Notably, these concerns were not raised in the context of patient and staff safety, but with reference to workforce absences, stories about PPE in the media, and the need to avoid delaying the lifting of social measures. There was no expression of concern for the safety of the people working and being cared for in these environments. And the reported response of the Department of Health and Social Care was that this was not an issue of concern. Meanwhile, and as described in evidence by Professor Banfield of the BMA, doctors were updating their wills and making sure their life insurance was up to date. The witness statement of Helen McNamara demonstrates real insight into this issue at paragraph 89, where she states, quote, "We kept being told that NHS capacity was elastic. My concern was that even if it was elastic, that was not the same as being infinite. It was only much later that I realised that what was meant by NHS capacity being elastic was the capacity of people working in the NHS to work themselves into the ground to keep people alive. So yes, they would cope, but the knock-on impact of that would be the consequences for the people involved. We had thought we would see the consequences of a broken NHS in the winter of 2020-2021. I fear that it took longer for the break to show, and we are living with the consequences of stretching it too far in terms of what is happening now. These consequences include historically high levels of waiting lists, a crisis in staff retention and recruitment, significant numbers of doctors still suffering from long COVID, and moral distress and injury for doctors and other healthcare workers who felt unable to provide the right level of care, including for their non-COVID patients. Finally, on impact, the inquiry is aware of the disproportionate impact of the virus on people from ethnic minority backgrounds and of the shocking statistics in this area, including analysis by the Health Service Journal, which found that 94% of doctors who died with COVID up to April 2020 were from ethnic minority backgrounds, even though this group makes up only 44% of NHS medical staff. The inquiry has heard evidence about the review by Public Health England into disparities, and particularly the impact of the pandemic on ethnic minority groups, published in June 2020. However, there has been little evidence of any tangible steps taken by government and ministers to address these disparities. Another key area where a lack of capacity significantly hampered the UK's ability to respond to the pandemic is the lack of public health capacity, including, crucially, testing and contact tracing. The UK entered the pandemic with inadequate test and trace capability, exacerbated by many years of underfunding in local and national public health, which meant that Public Health England was unable to rapidly scale up its contact tracing capacity when COVID-19 emerged as a threat. This greatly limited the options available to decision makers, including actions to contain and suppress the virus. Public Health England did in fact call for greater capacity and resources from at least the 12th of February, but these calls do not appear to have been acted upon. Such was the lack of focus in this area that politicians, including Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson, told the inquiry that they had wrongly assumed that the necessary testing and contact tracing capacity existed, only to find that it needed to be built mid-pandemic. The reason given for the decision to abandon test and trace on the 12th of March was because the UK was moving from the contain to the delay phase of the pandemic response. However, the reality is that there was no meaningful testing capability, and what little testing capacity existed at this time was needed for healthcare settings. The inquiry has heard about the relative success of South Korea, which operated a more effective test and trace system, partly because of their previous experience of MERS. Just as South Korea learned from MERS, it will be important that the UK learns from the COVID-19 pandemic and maintains sufficient test and trace capacity and capability so that future decision makers have this essential tool available to them. However, there are signs that vital pandemic infrastructure has already started to be dismantled, something raised as a significant concern by Sajid Javid in his evidence. A final point about public health relates to the range and diversity of the scientific advice available to government. In his witness statement, Professor Banfield raised concern at a lack of independent public health expertise within SAGE. And Professor Peter Horby told the inquiry that it would have been helpful to SAGE to have had greater expertise from frontline public health practitioners because while there were people in the room with public health expertise, quote, that's different from being at the front line running a public health department in a local council or on the ground, end quote. He said that science needs to be placed in both the policy context and the operational context, and that this would have helped refine the advice given. Regarding the timing of decisions in the early months of 2020, it is clear that much of February was lost to confusion and indecision. While a number of factors likely contributed to this, the BMA suggests that an area of focus for the inquiry should be on the way that risk was communicated. Boris Johnson was briefed on the 4th of February that a reasonable worst-case scenario would be up to 300,000 deaths. But it was not until a paper was produced on the 28th of February, in which the reasonable worst-case scenario of 520,000 deaths was posited, that he became alarmed. During this period, the probability of the worst-case scenario occurring increased from 10% in early February to the expression used on the 28th of February of, quote, increasingly likely, although not yet certain, close quote. A number of witnesses have referred to the difficulties in expressing and communicating probability. Professor Whitty said that when probability was expressed in remote terms, it can lead to an underestimation of the risk. And Lord Stevens said that during February, there was a lot of ambiguity about the probability of the reasonable worst case happening, and there needed to be greater clarity. For the ultimate decision maker not to have fully understood the nature of such a serious threat suggests the need for better understanding and communication of risks within government. That this was a collective and not just an individual failure is made clear by the widespread shock over the weekend of the 13th to the 15th of March, as the Centre, number 10 and the Cabinet Office were confronted by the realisation that the reasonable worst-case scenario would materialise much sooner than had been thought, with the very real prospect of the NHS becoming overwhelmed. This shock was described by Professor Halpern as a bolt from the blue. The penny had dropped. All of this calls for serious consideration of a more refined approach to risk assessment and to the communication of risk, as suggested by Professor Horby. Over the entire period of the pandemic, there was a failure to take a sufficiently precautionary approach. This is evident on a range of issues, including asymptomatic and aerosol transmission, the delay in imposing protective measures, and in seeking to open up too soon and too quickly. A more precautionary approach, for example, through a focus on ventilation and mask wearing, could have been taken without significant economic impact. And at key moments of easing throughout the pandemic, the BMA called for such an approach, which generally was not heeded. There is little evidence that the UK government learned from the mistakes of the first wave, leading into the inevitable second wave, despite the wide acknowledgement that it had the potential to be even worse than the first, and at a time when vaccines remained unavailable. Instead, the country opened up too quickly, typified by the reckless Eat Out to Help Out initiative, which was decided without scientific input, despite the obvious risk of adversely impacting COVID transmission rates, and in which respect a study from 2020 suggests it was responsible for between 8 to 17% of new infections. Once cases began to rise again, the delays and indecision through the summer and autumn of 2020 necessitated a further national lockdown. This was rightly referred to by Professor Angela McLean as a terrible moment, and powerfully described in her evidence in these terms, quote, "We delay and delay a decision, and then we have to slam the brakes on as hard as possible with the attendant social cost and economic cost," close quote. Sadly, this lack of a precautionary approach and failure to learn from mistakes continued throughout the pandemic, including through the summer of 2021, when the government encouraged the freedom narrative, which contributed to the widespread view that the virus had been fully contained, only for protective measures to be required once again in December 2021 in response to the Omicron variant. My lady, as a concluding point, it is accepted that there was a need to take account of the economic impact of the pandemic. However, there was a tendency towards a false dichotomy that the choice was between public health and the economy, when in reality, these were inextricably linked. It was possible to have better protected both public health and the economy would have been supported, not undermined, by more precautionary public health measures. Given the inevitability of further pandemics, there is an urgent need to find this balance. It will involve increasing NHS and public health capacity, coherent risk-based planning and strategies, and a precautionary approach that protects those most at risk. Thank you, Millie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stanton. Mr. Cohen? There you are.
My lady, I appear for the UK Statistics Authority. The authority has been very grateful for the opportunity that you and your team have afforded them to participate in these hearings and to hear what is being said. Every minute of the hearings has been carefully considered, and the authority remains determined to learn any possible lessons from that which has occurred. My lady, a number of themes have been drawn out by the authority from the evidence that has emerged, and I'm going to comment briefly on them on behalf of the authority. The first is that in recent weeks, and indeed this morning, you've heard evidence and submissions by reference to a table which was originally presented in evidence by Professor Sir Ian Diamond, the national statistician. The reference for that is INQ 000292765, page 10. My lady, plainly, it is not the role of the authority to seek to referee any dispute between different core participants as to what the statistical evidence that they have presented means. If anything, my lady, that's a matter for you. However, I am instructed to offer some observations by way of context in relation to that information. The first point to make is that those statistics which were, as I say, presented in evidence by the national statistician represent the best available information and the authority stands by them. The second point to make is that, to an extent, some of the data in that table has been corrected because it is based on a standard European population and control mechanisms have been used. Most particularly, that means that the age distribution of individuals in a given population has been corrected. And as such, what that data cannot be said to have been skewed by is differences in age distribution in different countries. The final point to make about that table, my lady, is that mortality is dependent on a very large number of variables. And indeed, like any statistic, interpreting requires some caution. It may be that on one view those statistics tell the inquiry something about the measures that were put in place in one country versus another, but it is equally possible that other variables in those different countries have had an effect on the results. So some caution is required before interpreting that table as if it were a ranking of different countries. My lady, the second point that the authority wishes to make is about data sharing and data access. a common theme in the evidence that you have heard has been the concern, particularly early in the pandemic, as to data sharing and getting hold of the information that was required. You may recall, my lady, that Professor Sir Ian Diamond enlarged on this in evidence, observing sharing data or being able to link data together has the potential to provide evidence to improve the lives of all our fellow citizens in a way that almost nothing else does. And that requires easy, ethical, privacy-enhanced data sharing. My lady, that is a clarion call on behalf of the data professionals involved in this process. And the ultimate need is to ensure that there are clear and consistent ways in which data can be shared. This might involve systems such as the Integrated Data Service that's currently being developed by the ONS, which involve using trusted research environments to ensure that data can be shared in a way which also commands public confidence. Because the authority is very well aware of the concerns that the public legitimately have at ensuring that their privacy is respected. My lady, the third topic that I want to visit briefly on behalf of the authority is the difficult issue of including information as to ethnicity on death certificates. My lady, as Sir Ian Diamond explained, he entirely agrees with the sentiment that it is vital that there is accurate information about the ethnicity of those who have died. You heard evidence, particularly from Ms. Badenoch, in which she suggested that she wasn't clear why that wasn't recorded, and it might simply be that it was not something anyone had ever really thought about. Lady, there's no criticism of the witness for that observation, but in fact, it is an issue which has been given the most anxious consideration. The system is under change. In 2024 and from then on, there will be a way of taking the self-identified ethnicity from a person's medical records and including that in mortality data. And the work that you heard evidence about from Professor Nasru also it continues to try and find the best and most innovative ways of tracing out mortality and ethnicity and linking them together. But there is a real concern about taking a situation in which a person has died and is unable to say, actually, no, that is not my ethnicity, and effectively deeming it after they've died to be the case. It's an issue which causes grave concern. So this is a matter on which work is ongoing. It doesn't necessarily admit to an easy answer, my lady, and the authority is anxious that well-meaning recommendations that ethnicity ought to go on death certificates don't open a course which would be unwise. My lady, the final theme to visit is really probably the most important single point that the authority wished to raise and represents something of a, well, it's a point that they certainly emphasise greatly. You heard evidence from a number of witnesses, including Mr. Cummings and others, that there was a lack of scientific literacy in number 10 and in other parts of government. And there were references to the need to bring in external professionals who could provide their expertise on these matters. The authority would simply say that it's important not to overlook whenever a crisis emerges, that the UK government is already fortunate enough to have very expert individuals in bodies such as the UKSA, but also in Go Science. And rather than rushing to bring in external individuals, one of the paramount lessons of this experience is the need to ensure that the government's own scientific expertise is used as rapidly as possible and that, for instance, figures such as the National Statistician are involved from the very first to ensure that they are able to give their perspective and to feed in to the process. Milady, you will receive some additional written submissions from the authority, but that is all I say on their behalf today, save for acknowledging that they have listened with sorrow and great sympathy to the evidence that you've heard from those who've been directly affected by the COVID pandemic, and they reiterate their sympathy and condolences to each of those individuals. My lady.
Mr. Cohen, can I just press you on one point that you raised, just in relation to the table?
Yes, my lady.
The number of caveats that you said in relation, don't use it as rankings, although you also said the authority stands by the figures. What would be the best description? A very rough guide? I mean, is there any, are you in a position to be able to give me any
My lady,
description?
it may be best for us to do this in writing.
Thank you.
Because the statistical experts on whose behalf I speak are doubtless all too aware that I am not a statistical expert. And they would want to make sure that what's said is accurate.
If they could provide, in as laywoman's terms as best they can, how reliable it would be as any kind of guide, that would be a great help. And explaining what you've explained about the caveats. Because, as you know, some core participants have placed some considerable emphasis on it.
My lady, yes.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Cohen. I'm sorry to press you. Mr. Phillips, there you are.
Milady, as you know, the National Police Chiefs Council is a national coordinating body. It represents all UK police forces. And, of course, in this inquiry, it is a core participant representing UK policing. And the police were, on any view, one of the key frontline organisations during the pandemic. In his oral evidence to former Assistant Commissioner Martin Hewitt, who chaired the organisation throughout, noted two particular impacts of the pandemic on policing. First, the NPCC recognised very early on that the pandemic required a dedicated police response. The national coordination of that response, established in March 2020, was Operation Talor. And as you know, Operation Talor covered just about every area of policing activity and deployed the available resources of the NPCC. Secondly, it was clear to the NPCC that normal policing activity, including the prevention and detection of crime, would have to carry on, despite the challenging conditions, and would, of course, continue after the end of the pandemic, whenever that was. And as I said in my brief opening submissions, the pandemic, of course, posed a wide range of challenges in every aspect of public and private life. Policing and police officers faced many such challenges as the pandemic affected every part of the service. On the one hand, there was the impact of the virus itself. Officers had to discharge their duties without knowing how long the pandemic would last, what the impact of infections and isolations would be on police resources, how the safety and welfare of individual officers and members of staff, as well as the people they came into contact with, could be effectively ensured. And you may remember Martin Hewitt succinctly put it that you can't police at 2 meters distance. But on the other hand, the police were expected, under the Coronavirus Act and the COVID regulations, to interfere with people's lives and with their freedom of movement in a way that neither the police nor the public had ever experienced before. And it is evidence to you, Mr. Hewitt described seeing at the start of the pandemic the policing measures implemented in other countries where the virus had spread ahead of the UK, and thinking that such measures had not been seen since the Second World War. Operation Tallow was therefore an unprecedented national response to this unprecedented situation. However, milady, it bears repeating that at all stages of the pandemic, the work of the NPCC and of Operation Tallow encompassed far more than the enforcement of the COVID-19 restrictions in terms of the coordination of that national policing effort. Moreover, the NPCC itself played no direct role in the enforcement of the regulations, the policing issue on which the inquiry has chosen to focus during this module. As you know, and so far as enforcement by the police was concerned, this remained at all times the responsibility of individual officers and forces. However, a vital aspect of the NPCC's work was the production, the dissemination of clear and accurate briefings and formal guidance for forces in conjunction, of course, with the College of Policing. The key guidance, as you will recall, was issued by the NPCC and the College in March 2020, and it was the 4 E's approach: engage, explain, encourage, enforce. That approach, I would suggest, was inherently flexible, and the message was simple. Enforcement was the last resort, after the first 3 E's had been undertaken. And as Martin Hewitt explained to you, compliance, not enforcement, was the object of the exercise, and I would suggest the proper metric of success. Any attempt to assess the police response to the pandemic solely by reference to the number of FPNs issued involves focusing disproportionately on the final stage of the 4 E's process. The overwhelming majority of police contact with the public and the police's achievement in securing compliance with the regulations came as a result of the first 3 E's. The 4 E's guidance, of course, reflected another fundamental point highlighted both by Mr. Hewitt and by Dame Priti Patel in their evidence to you, which is that in this country we have policing by consent. The task faced by the police in the pandemic was to encourage the public to comply with regulations which were judged by government to be both in everyone's best interests, whilst at the same time retaining their trust. And I said to you in my opening that that was a formidable assignment. Dame Priti Patel, in her evidence, said that the police had been asked to almost do the impossible. Their task was, as always, to enforce the law, and I stress again that it was no part of their remit to enforce government policy, still less to enforce government guidance. However, as you've now heard from a number of witnesses, that task was made the more difficult by the frequent changes to the regulations, by the speed of those changes, by the lack of consultation and little or no notice given to the police before changes were enacted, and of course, by the frequent discrepancies between the terms of the legislation on the one hand and government guidance or ministerial statements concerning it on the other. You heard, I would suggest, compelling evidence from Martin Hewitt about the difficulties which this caused the service in the largely uncharted territory of public health policing, despite what he also emphasised to you was a very strong working relationship with the Home Office. So it was significant that the then Home Secretary herself accepted in her evidence to you that the process of enacting regulatory changes was, and I quote, suboptimal at every single level. It's no exaggeration to say, milady, that UK policing and its leaders had to draw very heavily on their reserves of flexibility and resilience as they adapted to the novel responsibilities conferred on the service and sought to keep the public safe. Lady, the issue of the enforcement of COVID regulations has played a very minor part in these hearings, which have, of course, been largely devoted to high-level government decision-making. Indeed, it's been a striking feature of the many, many hours of submissions you've heard so far today that none has made any reference to, still less any criticism of the enforcement by the police of the regulations, a fair indication, I would suggest, of the very modest role the questioners played in these hearings. It features, you'll remember, as a single sub-issue in your lengthy list of issues, and only one day of evidence was directed to it. On that day, you heard, as I've said, from Mr. Hewitt on behalf of the NPCC, and my submission to you is that his evidence was considered, balanced, reliable, and authoritative. Lady, we'll put in detailed written submissions, of course, drawing on that evidence and on the other material the inquiry's gathered in relation to policing. But of course, if we can assist you in any other way, we're ready to do so.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Phillips. I understand that those who are still to speak were given a listing of tomorrow and would prefer to stick to tomorrow. So unless there's anybody who's particularly anxious to speak tonight, we shall pause now and return for 10 o'clock tomorrow. And I'm extremely grateful to everyone who's spoken today for admirably, almost to a man and woman, sticking to the time limits. Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow.